A young girl, just a teenager, is celebrating her impending wedding. She is the daughter of a tribal king, and she is about to join a new tribe that has been a guest of her kingdom. That tribe is now known as the Aztecs. As part of the ritual, 5 Aztec noblemen lead her to an ancient temple for the ceremony. But as she reaches the top, the noblemen suddenly veer her away from the altar and onto a slab of stone in front of the temple, one used for sacrifice. Each man holds a limb, while a 5th lifts an obsidian knife high in the air. With one searing move, he slashes it through her chest and extracts her still beating heart. That evening, the king is invited to a ceremony to celebrate the marriage. Instead, he finds a priest performing a dance, wearing the still glistening skin of his daughter. As part of the ritual, the Aztecs had flayed her to honor the god of fertility.
He saw this, and he was absolutely horrified at what he saw, his dear daughter. And so he and his forces immediately chased the Aztecs into the lake and onto this island where they sought refuge.
The marshy island was an unwelcoming place. Yet it was from here that the Aztecs would beat the odds against them and forge the most powerful empire of the Americas.
Hi, I'm Peter Weller. When I think of the Aztecs, I think of an elegant people with beautiful skin and flamboyant headdresses of many colors, and I think of floating cities and a terrific song by Neil Young about Moctezuma and Cortez. But I also think of knives, of obsidian glass ripping into chest cavities and hands, pulling out bleeding hearts and holding them high. Most of the Aztec sacrifices were performed in a temple atop a stone pyramid like this one. The Aztecs felt that without these offerings, the sun would literally cease to rise and the universe would die. Now, Aztec history is a fusion of fact and myth. But what we do know is that this murder, as horrific as it was, not only marked the beginning of the Aztec Empire, it also marked the location from where it would rise.
The island the Aztecs were banished to after their disastrous sacrifice of the princess was in Lake Texcoco, the largest of 5 interconnected lakes covering a valley about 40 by 70 miles. Today, this once vast and open valley is teeming with what is modern-day Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world. But 700 years ago, the island was so swampy, no one had laid claim to it. Now, as they gazed on the lake, the Aztec leader Tenoch announced to his followers that he had seen an eagle perched on a cactus in the middle of the lake, a sign from the gods that they had found their new home. They would name their city Tenochtitlan. Life is tough for the Aztecs in the early days of Tenochtitlan, but they have a vision of a powerful city modeled on an ancient and legendary city just 25 miles away. They called this city Teotihuacan, or City of the Gods.
We know very little about Teotihuacan because all we have is the archaeological remains. We don't have any writing, we don't have any documentation that really fleshes out what went on at this big city.
It was in ruins, even in Aztec times, but they believed it to be the stomping grounds of the gods and the literal birthplace of the sun itself. The place the Aztecs most revered in Teotihuacan was a pyramid that rose above the tree line. It was called the Pyramid of the Sun. The massive sun pyramid contains 1 million cubic yards of earth and stone, with a base roughly the same as the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. The Aztecs believed Teotihuacan was laid out in the image of the cosmos, created by their gods. Now it was this image they would attempt to replicate in the construction of their new city, Tenochtitlan. Taking on the challenge would be an Aztec leader named Ăcămapichtli. In 1376, he embarked on an ambitious plan to engineer an advanced city at Tenochtitlan. But there was a problem.
The swampy islands that they took over needed a lot of work. When they started to build anything, it would begin to subside.
There was simply no foundation on which to build. The Aztec solution would revolutionize the architecture of the Americas. They began by anchoring their buildings deep in the ground using a system of pilings made from wood. Workers cut stakes into 30-foot lengths, 3 to 4 inches wide. These were driven into the soft ground to make a foundation. The pilings were often surrounded with volcanic stone to add strength. Masons and bricklayers could then build walls on top of this base with confidence.
They have found wooden pylons to hold the foundations of the pyramids. The fact that it didn't sink or the fact that it didn't just topple, I think that's a major feat of engineering.
Tenochtitlan was an island city, but the lakes surrounding it were very shallow, sometimes only 7 feet deep. The whole thing looked like a giant metroplex floating on a pond. Originally, the only way to get from this floating city to the mainland was by boat. But the Aztecs eventually devised a series of causeways, sometimes 45 feet wide, that would connect their floating city to the mainland provinces. The causeway was supported by strong wooden pilings, the same pilings that supported their temples and other buildings. Thousands of these pilings had to be driven deep into the lake bed, and this presented a logistical challenge that could only be met by a strong, skilled labor force and the best of Mesoamerica's engineers.
To build a causeway, 2 lines of stakes were laid out. Then the space between them was filled with stones and earth until it reached several feet above the water level. This allowed the road to support enormous weight.
These causeways were built very straight, they were very wide, with bridges that would open up that connected the city to the north, to the west, and to the south.
The roads enabled the Aztecs to transport larger, heavier materials for building. But this presented a new challenge.
There were no beasts of burden in Mesoamerica, so everything had to be done with humans. No carts, no wheel.
Small loads would be carried on the back with a rope hung from the forehead. Large items like stone blocks or sculptures for a temple would be dragged by huge numbers of men pulling ropes, possibly using logs as rollers. Legend has it one stone bound for a temple required a force of 50,000 men to drag it from the mountains on the mainland, across the causeway, and into the city. The causeways would also present the Aztecs with a new way to get fresh water to Tenochtitlan. In the past, the Aztecs had transported water in canoes from the shore. But a huge boom in the city's population meant they needed a higher-tech solution to keep up with demand.
They wanted to use water from the springs on the mainland, and so they wanted to build an aqueduct.
But the springs were under control of the dominant tribe in the region, the ruthless Tepanecs.
The Tepanecs were the controllers or the dominators of all the valley. They had a very strong empire. So they were the lords of the valley. So the Aztecs were tributary subjects to them.
As the Aztec population grew, tensions with the Tepanecs began to simmer. Now the Aztecs decided to issue an ultimatum that could change the balance of power in the region.
The people of Tenochtitlan not only demanded that the Tepanecs give them the water, but also demanded that they help construct the aqueduct.
The Tepanecs' answer was swift and brutal. The Tepanec king, Maxtla, sent assassins who murdered the reigning Aztec leader in cold blood. This was the final straw. After decades of domination, the Aztecs would finally make their move and wage war against their ruthless overlords. and they would launch a series of wildly ambitious building projects around their growing island city that would earn them a reputation as the greatest engineers of the Americas.
The founding tribe of the Aztecs called themselves the Mexica. The country of Mexico gets its name from this tribe.
It is 1428, and the Aztecs have declared war on their overlords, a tribe called the Tepanecs. But to defeat the Tepanecs, they would need a little help from their neighbors. The Aztecs approached the nearby city-state of Texcoco. There, a decisive leader was on the rise. His name was Nezahualcóyotl, and his domineering leadership would be instrumental in forging the Aztec Empire. With Nezahualcóyotl at their side, the Aztec underdogs would go for the jugular. They launched an all-out attack on the Tepanec capital. After a siege of more than 100 days, they broke through Tepanec defenses and slaughtered their oppressors. After capturing the Tepanec king, Maxtla, King Nezahualcóyotl personally cut out his heart and sprinkled his blood into the waters of Lake Texcoco. Suddenly, the tables had turned.
That is the exact moment of the beginning of the empire, and the Aztecs became the leaders of the Valley of Mexico.
After conquering the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs could now turn their attention to bringing clean water to their growing city. Remarkably, the Aztecs would independently design and build something that only a few world empires would master: the aqueduct. The aqueduct actually had two channels, each about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide. One would be cleaned and maintained, while the other was being used so the water flow was never interrupted. The twin-tube aqueduct ran for 3 miles from the mainland to the center of the island city. In town, water streamed into public fountains and reservoirs, and was distributed to the public in large clay jars or by canoe.
In comparison to the Europeans, the Aztec were a very clean people. We know that the Aztec emperor bathed twice a day. So in terms of hygiene, the Aztec people was much more advanced than the Europeans.
While the Aztec nobles were bathing in luxury, at this time in Europe, plague caused by unsanitary conditions was killing millions. King Nezahualcóyotl's own bath was one of the most unique in the Americas. It was fed by a sophisticated aqueduct system that also brought running water to his palace grounds.
Behind me is the hill of Texcoco. And on this hill, Nezahualcóyotl built a fantastic pleasure palace. And around this palace, a virtual botanical garden filled with all of the exotic flowers of Mesoamerica. Nezahualcóyotl brought water from the Sierra Nevada mountains all the way down to here, into this hill, to his palace, just to water his plants.
To install an aqueduct there, Nezahualcóyotl had to fill a huge gorge between Texcoco and the next hill. As the water arrived at the first hill, it gathered in small pools built to control the speed of the flow before it reached the aqueduct. After crossing the aqueduct, the water ran in a circuit around Texcoco Hill, spilling off over the sides in rock-cut waterfalls to water the gardens. It ended up in a nearly perfectly round rock-cut pool called the King's Bath.
And from here, he could look upon his domain at Texcoco, and he could look down at the botanical gardens that he was watering with his fantastic aqueducts. It is indeed a bath fit for a king.
By the mid-15th century, with their empire on the rise, it was time for the Aztecs to choose a sovereign leader. He was called Moctezuma, and he would be the first of 2 emperors